Do you know what the worst sports-related air tragedy is? It is the crash of Southern Airways Flight 932 back in 1970, known as the Marshall University tragedy. All 75 on board perished, including 37 members of the Marshall University football team, when their plane crashed into a hill near Huntington, West Virginia. I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're diving deep with Craig Greenlee. He is the author of a powerful book, Marshall Ever After. This compelling sequel revisits the event, the tragic event, blending personal stories of grief and unity, exploring how it transformed a community and showcased the indomitable human spirit. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank our team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his powerful books. The links are below this interview. Greg, great to see you here today on Spotlight.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I'm very excited to talk about a story whose time has come, a story that is timeless, a story that never gets old.
Very, very true. You've written two books on it now, November Ever After and Marshall Ever After, which is a sequel. Obviously, this is a topic that's near and dear to your heart. You're connected to it. You were a student at Marshall University, correct?
Well, yes, and I also played football for a couple of seasons, so I knew most of the people who were on the plane. Knew most of the players, most of the coaches. As a matter of fact, my best friend, who was also to be my best man in December of 1970, was on that plane.
Amazing, amazing. Were you younger than them or older than them?
We all came in, well, a good bulk of the guys that came in that was on that 70 team came in 1968. So we were all 20, 21, 19, 20, 21 years old in that area, in that span.
So when that plane went down, where were you? Tell us what your reaction was, because part of it had to be like, oh my gosh, that could have been me. I could have been on that plane.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I had decided a year before that I would not play in my junior year. And it was really had nothing to do with any premonitions or anything like that. It's just that I had come to a point where I felt like I needed to devote more time to my studies and to envision a different side of life, so to speak, because it's a very being an athlete is you're part of a university, but it's a very different kind of life than it would be for a regular student. And the thing is that you couldn't go anywhere, whether you were a ball player or ex-ball player or just a regular student, and not be impacted by what happened. It was so devastating. It was so total. The shock, even now, is still is really hard to fathom, even for those who were there.
Absolutely, absolutely. What is the legacy of this tragedy? I mean, it's inspired you to write two books. Out of this awful plane crash came some good, some unity. Tell us about the impact on the community that was profound and lasting.
Well, the thing about Huntington is it was a college town, number
Mhm.
one, and it has been and always will be. And this is something that's very dear to the people in Huntington. And in fact, every year since the crash, they have like a memorial service
Mm.
um, in the on the anniversary of the crash every year. And as a matter of fact, I had the opportunity to be the keynote speaker at last year's event, which was my first time, which was like 53 years ago. And I think what most people need to understand is that you have the crash element of it, but
Mhm.
there's so much more that goes into it besides the crash itself. The crash itself is obviously, very devastating, something that no one will ever forget, a part of history, if you want to say that, because it is. But at the same time, I kind of try to stress this in my books, is that the victories come in the aftermath. It's
Mhm.
what happens afterwards that makes or break you. And for the people at Marshall and for those who were making decisions back then, someone decided not to stay in the woe is me mode and
Mhm.
decided that we're going to do something with this. It took a while, but it did happen. So it's a strong evidence that good things can and do happen in spite of awful circumstances. You
What
know,
were those good things, or what are those good things?
well, number one, you have those cherished memories of people that you don't want to, you always want to keep them to be remembered because those were the guys that really started what turned out to be a very marvelous saga for Marshall football. People don't remember right after the crash, Marshall was like one of the worst, maybe the worst team in college football, winning wise. They
Mm.
went from being the worst to being the winningest program in the 1990s, in the whole decade of the 1990s. So it was a long, slow process, but eventually they got there. And it's a story that nobody can ever equal. I mean, you look at all the football powers such as Ohio State, Alabama, Southern Cal, Georgia, all those folks like that. No college in the United States in a college American football has ever gone through anything like that. Wichita State was another school, but they don't even play football anymore. But they weren't completely almost decimated like Marshall was. I mean, you're talking about a program that had to start from virtually scratch and eventually build itself, through those years. And to have witnessed that, to see it, to have been there at the beginning when everything happened and to see how it has grown, that's the victory. That's
Yeah.
the victory that I think anybody can grab a hold of and understand is that if it's something that you really want to accomplish, you have to keep going.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you never know how close you are to achieving that dream. You never know how close you are to achieving that goal. So I give an example. For the example, the 1970 team, the official record was 3-6. But upon further review, what you find is that in four of those six losses, the average margin of defeat was 3.5 points.
Mm.
So 3-6 could have very easily been 7-2. So you never know. They weren't
Exactly.
that far off the mark. And so it would have been interesting to see how things would have gone that following year because they were an up and coming group and still not fully staffed. I mean, Marshall had had a recruiting scandal in 1969 that decimated the team. I mean, we were very strong. We had an undefeated freshman team, and a lot of the guys who played freshman ball that year, including me, were starters or sophomores. And things didn't go too well that first year. But the thing is that we had a lot of quality athletes.
Mm.
But what happened was Marshall got busted for like over 100 recruiting violations. And so we had a squad in that spring of about like 80 some guys, 82 guys, I believe. But by the time the scandal hit that summer, everything we came to practice and we only had 42 players.
Right.
So that's not enough. Football is a sport where you need numbers. And of course, you have good athletes, but if those guys get hurt, you're in trouble.
Exactly. And it's a kind of game where people do get hurt and get pulled out all the time. So
Exactly,
you need
exactly,
backups. It's like an army. You need to have reserves,
exactly.
sure. Let's talk about the legacy on the community. It was unifying. People of all ethnicities and races came together after the plane crash as well, right? That's part of the aftermath of this tragedy, right?
Well, it's one of the things that I think it gets overlooked. See, what people don't realize is that, and that's another thing that one of the reasons that prompted me to write these books, particularly the first one, November Ever After, is that there are narratives of those who were there, those who lived through it, that haven't been told or that most people know little or nothing about. So, as a matter of fact, what happened was the day before the crash which was a Friday the 13th that year.
Mm.
There was a huge brawl on campus between a Black Student Union, Black Student Organization, and one of the white fraternities. And it was so bad until the city police had to be called in.
Mm.
and 3 people were hospitalized, had to be taken to the hospital. And it was so bad until uh, among the black students, we thought there was going to be a full blown race riot because
Mm.
there were threats being made about what was going to happen that night and all those kind of different things. So everybody was on alert. But now you go from that combative mode one night, Friday night, to the next night, probably 27 hours later, and you're dealing with a total catastrophe where all these people that you knew, that you went to class with, that you partied with, that you ate lunch with, and all those kind of different things, they're gone.
Yeah.
And it's like, what are we going to do now? And so all those different beefs and racial slurs and just all the tension and everything like that, it really didn't matter. It's as though it never really happened. It was so the devastation was so complete. Everybody was just trying to focus on like, wow, what are we going to do? How are we going to honor these people? What can we do? So you had that, and you also had a situation which I hope never has to happen again. But what happened was that there were a group of students that went on a chartered bus trip to attend services for seven of the players who perished,
Mhm.
and this was a tearful, tearful trek. Uh, Bluefield, West Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Greenville, South Carolina. A trip that covered like seven funerals for 7 guys that took 4.5 days that covered 1,500 miles.
Mm.
And that's something that I think most people don't know about. And
Yeah.
that's so unique in itself. That's a story in itself
Yeah.
about all the things that went on, during that journey, which I have a chapter about in both books about that. So that you have that aspect of it, and how that group was formed out of that actually did tribute shows for about a year or so after the crash, and paying homage to those who died.
Amazing. It is amazing that people did come together. It was a tough year. 1970, racial tensions in the South were still at a level of danger at times, such as
Yeah,
the fight that
exactly.
broke out on the university that you mentioned, the college, as you mentioned. This tragedy, of course, also had an impact on you personally. You became a sports journalist. Is that part of the reason why you became a sports journalist? You wanted to follow up on sports more closely in light of what had happened and being so close to these young men who died?
Well, that sounds logical, but being in sports was something that I had no plans of getting into. Really, my thing was I wanted to be more of a columnist type of person. Write about different anything other than sports, because my college sports career didn't go the way that I wanted to, and I very seldom talked about it. In fact, the papers that I worked at, the magazines I worked at, they knew I went to Marshall, but they never knew I played ball, and they asked me, "Well, why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Well, you never asked." So I mean, it's just one of those things that I just kind of gravitated to it after I got in the Air Force, and I don't know, maybe it was something I was destined to do, but it was not something that I had a strategic plan, in place for that.
Yeah. Well, we're glad you did get into sports journalism. You're a terrific writer. You've written 2 books now, November Ever After and the sequel, Marshall Ever After. If you want to learn more about this era, more about this school, more about this tragedy, more about the personal stories that came out of it and how people triumphed despite this awful, awful event, Craig Greenlee has written these 2 terrific books that are extremely powerful. And I don't know if a movie has been ever made about it, Craig, but I certainly think the Marshall University air tragedy and your books would be perfect fodder for that, don't you think?
Well, it's kind of ironic that you mentioned that, because there was a movie. In
Hmm.
fact, We Are Marshall came out in 2006, I believe. And it did its job as far as um, giving the story notoriety.
Mhm.
But there were so many inaccuracies in it, which I guess is typical for Hollywood. But it's a marvelous story that just needs to tell itself.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that I try to do when I've written these books is to just get out the way and just let the story tell itself.
Yeah.
And the beauty of it is that there are a lot of us who are still around who can, you know, verify that these things. This is not like one guy's perspective. This is a collective perspective, if you want to call it that, of a number of people. And of course, everybody's different. Everybody has a little bit of a different take because we're individual like that. But
Mm.
I've always looked at the Marshall story, and I've said this often, as it's like a giant bicycle wheel with a gazillion spokes.
Yeah.
And all these spokes represent a different story. And there's so many of them out there. And I don't know if we'll ever know all of them.
Right.
I know that there's an alumni group at Marshall that's working on a book now that's going to be dealing with the families of the victims, and they're putting. I don't know anything about it other than that the book is coming out. I don't know when or anything like that. But I think that it's great that we share these things because for so long people have been reluctant either because they didn't think they were supposed to talk about it or either just the pain is still so great that folks don't want to talk about
Yeah.
it. As a matter of fact, that's from what I'm told. That's one of the reasons why it took so long for the movie to come out, like 30 some years after the fact, and because people were just so haunted by it. And when you just think about just the sheer horror of it, and it's just something that you'll never forget. You know,
Absolutely.
even if you
Particularly,
wanted to. Yeah.
particularly if you're a family member,
Yeah.
that pain never goes away. What would have
Yes.
been, what could have been, for half a century now, the
Yes.
legacy of their lives was erased back in 1970, if not for people like you who keep their stories alive. Craig Greenlee has written two terrific books once again, Marshall Ever After, and the book that preceded that, November Ever After. Greg, thanks so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
I'm glad I was here. Glad to be able to kind of speak what needs to be spoken. I appreciate the opportunity.
And I appreciate your time as well, sir. Everything was so well said. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.